Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today. Um, my name's Marie Wadeson, and I am a managing director here at K3 Advisory Group, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's session is a masterclass in translating business growth into long-term value. Before I introduce you to our panelists, I'd like to give you some background to today's session. So back in March, we published the findings of an extensive data-backed research report, which analysed over 134,000 UK businesses to understand what structural growth businesses look like. We segmented the businesses into four different primary archetypes, which describe their overall scale capability based on a wide range of data and behavioural points. Our research revealed that only 6.4% of businesses identified as scale ready. I think the slide on the screen should be showing you the distribution of the businesses we analysed across the different archetypes. Um, we'll also be considering what differentiates scale-ready businesses from the rest. Productivity is the biggest differentiator. So our research showed that 300 that scale-ready businesses um, had £322,000 worth of revenue per employee versus 48k in structurally fragile firms. Earnings quality matters more than growth rate, with the research showing that 94% of the bottom 20% of firms exhibit with growth consistency. Cash creates strategic choice, with 75% of scale ready firms operating in a net cash position. And finally, tax structure and optimization is very much a hidden growth lever. So the research provides an interesting backdrop for today's discussion. It shows that growth alone isn't necessarily the challenge. The real challenge is building a business that can sustain that growth, remain resilient, and ultimately become more valuable over time. So today we're going to move beyond the statistics and explore what that looks like in the real world through the experiences of our panel. So, without further ado, I would like to be able to introduce you to our panelists today, who all draw from the K3 Advisory Group. First up, I've got Daniel Sladen. He's a managing director at K3 Tax Advisory. Daniel is a tax advisory specialist, specialising in corporate and business tax. He has a background in capital markets and finance, and he advises on financial structuring, international tax, and complex transactions. His clients include business owners, private equity, and shareholders in small to medium-sized corporate groups and family companies. I'm next to welcome Ian Barton, who's a managing director at K3 Deal Advisory. Ian is a managing director, as I've just said, specialising in corporate finance. He has more than 30 years' experience advising shareholders on M&A plans, sourcing funding, and planning shareholder restructuring. Whether the shareholding objective is investing for growth or planning an exit, Ian supports them through all of the complexities of a transaction to ensure he delivers shareholder value. Rachel Tyndall joins us today. She is a managing director at Pinnacle, a leading provider of cloud-based accounting, ERP, and managed IT services, supporting over 2,000 SMEs across the UK and Ireland. She has a background in data-driven decision making and over 30 years' experience in the Sage and ERP space. And finally, Sam Phillips is a managing director at K3 Advantage, which provide integrated advisory support across transactions, tax, and strategy for businesses navigating growth, change, or complex decisions. The majority of Sam's work has been private equity led or being funded by private equity. And this has been both buy and sell side. So he understands both sides of the fence and useful perspectives the useful perspectives that this brings. For transparency, today's audience predominantly comprises those operating in the professional, financial, advisory, and investor communities. We do, however, also have a number of business owners joining us today, so thank you for joining. Right, so we'll move on to our panel session then in that case. So, first of all, I think that we will look at growth, scale, and value. So, Ian, I think I'll turn to you first. So, when we talk about growth, scale, and value, what do these terms actually mean in practice?
I think when I think about those terms, I sort of see growth as being an outward-looking sort of mindset. So it's about what are the opportunities in the market? How can I position my business within that market? And then how can I exploit those opportunities and outcomes through actual action and activity. And I think scale is a more inward-looking focus that says, okay, I've identified the growth, I've decided how I want to go about it. How can I sustain, replicate, cause efficiency and effectiveness within that growth? So it's about controlling that growth. It's about working on the business. And I think that, the survey sort of shows, quite a sort of a polarized sort of approach to that. And I think that that comes from the fact that entrepreneurs are always sort of continually trying to improve, move their business forward, either recovering from difficult things or exploiting opportunity. And sometimes it's difficult to take a step back and think about the things that will cause scale. So what are those things that will position you to go quicker, make the boat go faster, if you like, if you're a rowing analogy? How do I keep doing that? And value for me is the product of those two things. How do I take the growth opportunity that I've exploited, and then how can I most efficiently deliver that in the business such that, as a business owner, I'm not continually doing the same thing over again, but I'm building a system, I'm putting the right people in place, I'm causing growth that can be scaled. And I think, we look at businesses that have got recurring revenue, i.e., businesses that have built a scalable model that continues to deliver without the entrepreneur or the business owner having to be as hands-on, and that's scalable growth. And from a value perspective, that's the most valuable. And that value is delivered, to the stakeholders in the business, whether that's the people, whether that's the customers, the suppliers, because the business is getting bigger and therefore their opportunities are getting bigger, but also from a financial perspective for the owner, in that it's just growing the enterprise value for them. And if they choose to sell, they hopefully have got a more valuable business because that business is replicable by another owner, not just by you as the owner who's built it to date.
Very good, thank you. And I had to smile when you talked about rowing the boat and making the boat go faster. I think it's something we've talked about many times over
It
the
is.
years.
It is. It's an
Um,
analogy I use quite a lot.
Indeed, indeed. Sam, coming to you then. So, why do some businesses become more valuable as they grow, whilst others simply just become bigger?
So I think you've got to look at what, come back to Ian's sort of comment, what does growth and scale mean? So growth is more than just about sort of more revenue. It's about becoming repeatable. It's about becoming profitable. Whereas scale sort of is where growth stops becoming expensive. And so if you're having to constantly push for every pound of profit, you're growing, you're creating more complexity, you're creating more challenges. Whereas actually, if you can create a business and a model that can sort of row its own boat, so to speak, using that same analogy, then actually you're unlocking a huge amount of efficiency. And so it's then therefore more repeatable. It gives the outside of looking in a much better perception of the value, because it's only, a business is only worth what someone is prepared to pay for it. And if they can see the value in the future and what's being created, it's much more than what goes in the past. And so actually, what is the scale that you're buying? It then becomes sort of the key factor to consider. Well, you're on mute, Marie.
Sorry, right. There's a first time for everything here. Um, so Daniel, strong foundations then, and the importance of having informed decision making. What do you make of that?
I think bringing that back to the idea of value, that when we look at tax structuring and tax risk management, the key thing is that a lot of the foundations, a lot of the things that need to be done can create problems, effectively destroy value in ways that are not obvious for a long time. So it's really important that as the business grows, that scaling is about making sure that risks are identified and controlled, sensible advice is taken, so that anything that is kind of gradually building up behind the scenes as a risk, which wouldn't become obvious in the future, is something that management are fully aware of and can make sensible decisions. So, you know, depending on how far we can go with this analogy, I think it's not so much a case of a boat having a massive hole in it, it's more being nearly through on the hull and gradually making things worse until one day you find out you've got a problem. So it's really crucial that as the business gets larger and more complex and needs the right advice to avoid any kind of damage from tax expense, that the management team are fully aware of how to deal with that.
So Daniel, you touched on the advisory community for a second there, and obviously today's audience draws from primarily that audience. So, what's the importance of the advisor relationships and sort of, I guess, the point around regular external challenge?
I think the key thing is just that the variety of challenges and subject matter that any growing business faces is, large and complex and unpredictable. So it's not ever realistic to expect that management or even any given advisor will be an expert in everything that's needed. So it's just important to really keep under review what's going on, what advice is needed to make sure that it's fully understood and to bring in the right specialists at the right time.
Fair enough. Ian, any views on that, or Sam?
I think one of the biggest challenge when you are starting a business and building a business is bringing in other voices. And there's a time for that. There's a time where you have to be the leader and make a decision and drive a business forward. And then there is a time when you need to take other advice, bring in other ideas. You see boards that build with non-exec directors and things like that. And it's a real moment for an entrepreneur to sort of accept that they need advice because it's their risk. They've built the business. They've lived and owned every one of those decisions. But that's what scale is. Scale is about how do I take all the good things that I have been doing and do them easier, do them bigger, and allow myself to go on to the next thing. So it's about I can use my ideas because I've left behind a system that works and people that work to make sure that the rest of the business operates without me having to have my hands on it all the time. And I think those are the defining elements of scale. The dependency on the business owner dissipates over time, and having the confidence in those people and those voices that you listen to.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now that we've done our sort of definitions, then let's move on a little bit. So let's have a look at what genuinely scale-ready businesses look like. So, Rachel, coming to you then. So what are the characteristics of a business that is genuinely built to scale? Is this as much about systems as anything else?
Yeah, I suppose for me, a business that's genuinely built to scale has a few obvious characteristics, but overall, scalable businesses rely on technology to enhance efficiency and reduce those manual interventions and deliver overall, most importantly, deliver a smooth, available customer experience. What does this mean in practice? Well, it means an operating model built around scalable cloud software business systems that enable, firstly, low customer acquisition cost, and that's through automation. Secondly, 24/7 customer access, allowing clients to look at product, process orders, and get that information instantly. Thirdly, streamlined digital first processes that definitely eliminate paper and use technology. Integrated workflows and AI-driven systems that automate interactions with customers and with other suppliers and provide financial reporting instantly. And finally, importantly, I think every business, retention of customers through slick customer experience supported by technology to maximise that customer value. I suppose to specifically on systems and operational readiness to truly build for scale. As a business first needs to have the right foundations in place, and that starts with their systems and processes. At the core, that means implementing software solutions that are inherently scalable, and I think this is a common discussion point at the moment, because typically that is cloud-based, and cloud-based products really are the backbone. Although having technology like this isn't just enough, those systems need to be configured properly by people who understand how to design them for growth. And that means minimizing the need for manual intervention, so reducing dependency on headcount and using automation, workflows, and integrations, which is a key word for any business system, to keep things moving efficiently. Now, many businesses today, they're not operating like this. They're operating very, very differently. So they're still relying on on-premise systems, so legacy software, finance systems, and often multiple spreadsheets, dare I say, that are sat in isolation rather than working together. Over time, that type of setup becomes inefficient, and it becomes dependent on individuals. It requires manual input, check-in, reconciliation, and reworking data. And the impact of all that is cost and headcount. And as your revenue grows and your system falls behind, your costs increase, and therefore the business is less scalable. I think we've all been working on technology when it becomes a burden, things like upgrades, software upgrades, patches, downtime, dealing with cyber threats, and all of that introduces additional costs, unexpected costs. And when you compare that with the cloud software world, it's very, very different. So these systems are accessed anywhere. There's a browser and an internet connection. They work across time zones, they work across languages, they can connect seamlessly to banks, yep. And therefore getting real-time information, and e-commerce platforms straight out of the box. So things like...
Sorry, you touched on quality of data and management information, slightly earlier, and also connected systems. Sam, I wonder if you got a view on all of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I could talk about all day, so you'll have to stop me a little bit, because it's something that every day I'm dealing with businesses that are looking at how they can improve their understanding of their business, the reporting, the margin, how do they grow. It's something that we've put a lot of time and effort in to develop, sort of Advantage IQ, which is a platform that we use to try and bring all the systems together ultimately. But I suppose it comes back to having a sort of single source of truth. Rachel pointed to businesses looking to embed lots of different systems for different parts of their business, which is great on one hand, that the tools are there, but so often that means that you're pulling in different sources of information for different needs. Different people in the business are therefore having to go and ask other people for views. And as a result, you end up with a misalignment of what is the truth? Where is margin coming from? How am I going to get to the next phase of growth? And so having a very focused and consistent sort of KPI dashboard that you use to run your business with, which is being driven from the various systems that you use that can scale as you grow, is the way that you're then going to be able to forecast into the future with actual insight, rather than just using hindsight from the past, which may have worked then, but actually may not work as well as you're growing. And so what that does ultimately is give you sort of clear visibility of the unit economics of really what's driving revenue and margin, to be able to make those investment decisions. And so I guess for me, data supports scalability, and it creates accountability as well. so that people take responsibility for what they're trying to achieve, and the relevant business heads within a business can actually take that forward.
Yeah, fair enough. Ian, so as we were preparing for the session last week, we touched on scalable businesses being able to scale their back office sort of capability at the same time. Do you want to just touch on that briefly?
Yeah, I think, it's always easier to cause change earlier than it is later. So I think we talk in the report about are you scaling growth, or are you scaling complexity in your business? And it's much harder to go backwards and put in place guardrails to protect yourself and put the right compliance functions in after the event than it is to potentially anticipate those and then build your business in that right direction. I mean, the data and information are the key words for me here, because it's about, can you capture the right data, and then can you make the right decisions off that data? So can you anticipate the issues before they arise, and can you exploit the opportunities before your competitors do? And that will often come from managing your data in a way that gives you information and gives you, as an owner or a board, the capacity to challenge yourselves as to whether you're making the right choices, or whether a slight tweak here or there will do that. But we see that if you set things up in the right way, you're giving yourself the right bedrock to build off. It won't always be a smooth journey, but at least if you've always got something to fall back to, that you're doing it in the right way, you will build from that foundation, ultimately the business that you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move on now to how we can judge the quality of growth. So, Sam, I think I'm going to come to you for this one. So, what tools, information, and KPIs should businesses use, or business owners even use, to judge whether their growth is healthy?
That comes back to, I suppose, just fundamentally is having the right data in place in the first instance, because if you don't have that, then trying to actually monitor and track that becomes very, very difficult. I guess I look at sort of quality of growth is about managing economics and thinking about how much risk are you taking, and what impact is that going to have on the future. Because if growth is actually diluting profitability, so if you're looking, we all know our standard metrics around gross margin percentage and EBITDA, net profit percentage, and we're looking at the level of working capital that we hold in the business. If actually we can see, yes, we might be growing at a top line, but actually that growth is really impacting on our margin, or it's increasing the working capital requirements of our business. Therefore, we need more cash to continue operating at the same or greater level. Is that actually scale? And so I mentioned it earlier, are we having to push harder for every unit of growth? If we're not sort of tracking, if we're a manufacturing business and we're not tracking the level of CapEx relative to revenue, or CapEx relative to EBITDA, then are we actually spending that money in the right place? You mentioned revenue per employee. There are some very basic metrics, even if there aren't the systems in place to track price versus volume, that can give you some very high level indicators around the trajectory of the business. So, touch on profitability, efficiency, there's that predictability, and how can you see the level of recurring revenue within your business? If you can create more certainty, that in turn creates more value. And so, if the growth is creating strain, it absolutely isn't scaling. It's probably more stretching, which then, as a result, risk exposure comes in. And I suppose one way of looking at it is, if you said 3 years ago, if we lost one customer and that had a material impact on the business, if now we're to lose one customer and it would have a material impact on the business, actually your risk is scaling too. And so it's having those points to just really have as your sort of red flags to keep track of the sustainability of the scale of the business.
Okay, so I guess there's a point in here around data giving you the ability to pivot decisively when circumstances change.
Absolutely. And if you have the I guess the speed of the data, which is really important because it's all very well, we see so often management board packs being produced 2, 3 weeks after month end. That could be the difference between a real fundamental business concern and the ability to change very quickly. And so having systems processes that report instantly is why we developed IQ, was so that we could ensure that businesses can report instantly, so they can start to see these red flags very, very quickly. Because as they're growing and as they're getting bigger and scaling, Ian mentioned this earlier, it's harder to change. It's harder to change direction as, over a certain size. Whereas if you get those processes in sooner, you can react quicker.
Okay. So Sam, you mentioned IQ. Just give us a couple of high level bullet points on that.
Well, cool. I won't sort of burden everyone too much, but think of it as a layer that sits over all of your systems that you've got, whether it's financial, operational, HR, ERP, that reports in a consistent, unified format, so that in essence they all talk to each other. Yes, they can plug into an accounting system in isolation in a basic format, but the whole concept of the system is that it brings it all together. So you've got one place, one single source of truth that updates instantly, so that all the systems talk to each other.
Very good. Okay. So we'll circle back to the audience afterwards with some information about that.
Yeah.
Ian, just coming back to that point on the ability to pivot decisively when circumstances change. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that there's two things really. One is resilience to shocks in your business. So, information, data, constant monitoring allows you to see that shock because growth is never smooth. And sometimes it won't go as planned, and you'll have to pivot, as you've said. But the resilience to that, so that it's not damaging to the business, it's just holding you back, or it's just delayed you in getting to where you want to get to. So first of all, the pivot can be because you have to be the resilience that comes from that. But I think the other bit is we all have seen lots of really great businesses who are good at business planning, but they're not necessarily great at business monitoring. And if you've got a plan that is saying we're going to do this and we're going to do that, making sure that your management information is actually informing you about those specific plans. And this is sort of what Sam's saying, I think, around making sure that you're bringing that data together to give you information to make the right choice. Because otherwise you can cause growth, but if you've got growth without the efficiency of growth, then all you're doing is building complexity faster than you're building value. And that's then a real challenge because, like the fairy lights at Christmas, if you're trying to untangle everything once it's got really complex, it takes a lot longer than if you'd wound them all up in a nice ball to start with the previous year. And so for me, the pivot is about how you monitor that pivot as well. And was that the right pivot, or should you pivot again? And if we are pivoted and it's worked, how do I now go faster and push harder in terms of going down that route because we've found a way of doing this? That's what management information can give you.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, so moving on to our next theme then in that case. So this is around the visibility of weaknesses, I guess, surfacing when outsiders start looking. So Daniel, I think I'll come to you for this one. So why do businesses often discover weaknesses only during, events such as say due diligence or, funding or transaction type processes?
Yeah, I mean, talking about it through a tax lens, although I think a similar principle applies for other areas as well. The key thing to think about is that we tend to think about tax risk as things that happen when HMRC take a look at a business and say, you owe us some more tax. Because of relatively limited resources at HMRC and other factors, we don't have a year-by-year tax audit process. So there's plenty of things that can be wrong, that can be exposures which go entirely unnoticed for a long time. Now, when it then comes to due diligence on a sale, then DD advisors are looking at everything systematically in detail, which means any weakness, any risk really should be picked up at that point. So not only can that be risks that the selling business is not aware of, but they can also be many years worth. I mean, in the worst cases where things haven't been disclosed to HMRC, the inquiry window could be 20 years long. So obviously there's scope for some very large adjustments indeed. So the key thing to think about with this really is that your biggest risk, in a sense, is not HMRC. It's a risk-averse buyer with a conservative advisor who's good at spotting weaknesses. So you can go from feeling everything is basically fine to having a long list of issues quite quickly in the course of that process, which is why it's so important to be thinking about it as the years go by ahead of a sale rather than just at the time or a few months before.
Very good. Okay, so is there a role for AI here? So obviously it's hugely topical right now. AI is everywhere, and I was at a legal conference last week. AI was the key topic there. Um, Thoughts on AI as a sort of a useful source of information? Sam, Ian, Daniel, Rachel, all of you, in fact. I guess you've all
I, th-
got a
I think
view on it.
I would say it is and can be. It can also be a tool that is not right and creates hallucinations. And we used it just as an anecdote, and we put something in, and it came up with a stat, and we said, well, what's the source for that stat? And it came up with something, and we said, no, but what is the specific source? And it actually came back and said, I'm going to level with you. I've made that up. And I think that's the risk, that you see it as being this source of information that must be right. Um, but you must challenge it. You must challenge it. Don't, use your trusted advisors, use the people that, the voices in your business that you've brought in to help you grow it. Because actually, for me, it's an algorithm. It's information that's produced through through its own use. It is not necessarily a thought-provoking tool as it stands, and actually it needs challenge. And if you use it in the right way, it can be a very efficient use of sourcing information. But I often regard it as being, it will get you to 80% of the answer, but you still need the human element to overlay that 20% to test it, provide rigor, and actually think about alternatives or question it. So take care, I think, with it. And just because it's telling you an answer, don't necessarily believe that that's the only answer that it could be.
Sam, how about you? Any views?
Yeah, I think I would sort of add to that and look at it in the same way as if you've got your board, you've got your sort of trusted or your team of employees, and you're asking them questions. They've got their inward looking view. They're probably a little bit more emotive. Haven't quite seen it from the outside looking in, so sort of trying to sort of bring it back to the original question. You can sort of actually see that in AI as well. So you sort of see AI as it's probably going to reason with you, want to get you on board, get you comfortable that the AI knows the answer, is going to sort of say what you want. But then you need to go out of that and sense check it, which is sort of the same as an advisor who isn't sort of in the business, but is coming in and looking quite independently, hasn't got the same emotion attached, and therefore might not give a sort of biased view. So there's sort of an odd sort of comparables there in terms of how I would look at it. Because actually what feels normal from the inside, you might be talking to AI and having a good sort of conversation and getting some really sort of helpful responses. But actually from the outside, that's actually a little bit fragile and not as robust in terms of how to get the next answer. Or if you're talking about the next sort of version of growth, you might then get a sort of more robust response from an advisor who's less sort of invested or less emotionally sort of attached to it, or perhaps saying what you want to hear. And don't forget, a lot of founders are subject matter experts, fantastic at their field. Being a sort of growing and scaling a business is a very sort of different sort of role, and it is about growing and developing into that role, and taking on board sort of advice and recommendations from sort of people who've done that before.
Any views from you, Rachel, before we move on the role of
Yeah.
AI?
Yeah, well, you find AI is automatically included in business systems now, in cloud systems. In my experience, using that AI in your your cloud system and your finance system, it's only as good as the data it's looking at. So if the data is incorrect, the answer is incorrect. And you're not going to get away from that, however powerful the AI tool is. It's most commonly used in systems at the moment as an automation tool. So it's to repeat those steps that typically will take a lot of time from a person, from a user in that software. And that's, at the moment, that's the benefit of AI. It automates, it moves the process quicker. But again, it's only as good as the data it's looking at.
Fair enough. So I guess what I'm taking from this part of the session then is that important decisions should be scrutinised carefully and probably validated with a trusted advisor, and also that unresolved issues can compound as businesses scale. That's what I'm taking. So moving on then. So I think, Sam, I'm going to come to you for this one. So we're going to look at now how businesses maintain control. So how is it that businesses maintain control as they scale, Sam?
So I would say don't do what you might think you do and hold on sort of tighter, because if you sort of hold on tighter, you're sort of then going, what can this business run without you? You as the founder sort of holding everything together. It's really around sort of for me having clear sort of visibility. You know what's happening, absolutely. Consistency, and so if you sort of develop clear processes, then regardless of whether you are involved or not, things are going to happen in the same way. And that might not always mean the way that you want them to be, but having a discussion and delivering that message in terms of the right process, so that then it becomes predictable. You can rely on sort of the outcomes that are going to be sort of going to happen from that. And then naturally there's accountability, because there's clear sort of roles and expectations of the team. And what that means is that as a founder and transitioning to sort of CEO as the business is scaling, is that you are really delivering a clear vision around the strategy, so that the business can therefore implement the processes that you've set up. And that means that you've still got control, you've still got visibility, as I mentioned earlier, but you're not sort of grabbing onto it and trying to hold onto it. You're letting it sort of run in the direction that you've set, so that you're actually reducing reliance on you as an individual. That doesn't mean that you're sort of absolutely not needed in the business. It just means that it can continue and can grow, and therefore create more value, so that the value isn't just on any or select few individuals as a result.
Very good, thank you. Rachel, what about systems? What role do systems play here? So this is about businesses maintaining control as they scale.
Okay, yes. Well, I suppose businesses maintain control as they scale by resisting the temptation to make things more complicated than they need to be. So as organisations grow, complexity naturally creeps in, and more people, more customers, more projects, more moving parts create confusion. So if there isn't a clear operating model underneath it, the businesses that scale successfully will focus on simplicity, consistency, and discipline, which I think that's what Sam was talking about. Standardizing and documenting your processes means everyone follows the same approach, regardless of who is doing the work and what system is doing the work. As long as the process, you can digitalize a process, but if it's the wrong process, if the process is not right in the first place, all you're doing is making that process quicker. You're following it quicker. Also, I would say success on scaling is less dependent on individual personalities and more dependent on well-defined ways of working. Again, coming back to systems and processes and standardizing. Investing in technology and automation is how you can do that. Automation is embedded in cloud systems, in your business systems today, rather than relying on manual effort. As soon as you have manual intervention into a process, that's where errors occur. That's where transactions slow down. That's where customers get frustrated and so on.
Great, thank you. Ian, again, while we were preparing last week, we talked about, the notion of support functions keeping up or keeping pace with growth. But what are your views around that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that, I echo everything that Rachel and Sam have said there around dependency and quality of systems. I think people is still a big part of that, and I think fundamentally that comes down to trust, whether it's trust in the system that you've built, and the system doesn't necessarily mean a digital system. It just might be a process for how you go about some part of your business. So putting the trust in the people who are running that system or are building that system, who are going to implement it, are going to monitor it, who are going to feed back the results of those actions so that you can make better decisions the next time. And that trust element is often the biggest challenge for business owners for all the reasons we've discussed about and for all the risks that Sam flagged around holding tighter and creating more dependency. You've got to let the governance come out through delegation, because that's the way that you scale. One person can only there are only so many hours in a day for one person. You have to replicate that as much as you can. You can replicate that through people, you can replicate it through systems, but fundamentally you need to trust in those things to allow yourself to grow. And that can be quite liberating for business owners. It will undoubtedly be quite fearful at first, because it's their business, it's their investment, it's their livelihood that they have established. But those are the businesses that tend to move on quicker.
Fair enough. I was going to hold the questions until the end, but actually there's one that's come in that's quite apt at this point. So I'm just going to dive in with that one. So question reads, many SME founders, while scaling up, seem to miss focusing on key roles like FD or HR head, which will add a backbone to their organizational robustness, sorry. Fractional could be a cost-effective solution. Any thoughts on that? So adding fractional roles as opposed
I guess
to
it's
going full time.
There's sort of two parts to the question. I guess is sort of not or missing those roles early on in the sort of early stages of a business, and then as you're scaling, is fractional potentially a route? Is perhaps just how I'd sort of look at it. First question is totally sympathise with putting an FD or HR role sort of further back, because focus is always in growing top line, winning work, trying to deliver that work. And you often feel or can feel like by spending time on some of the detail and some of the data is not generating immediate value to pay the bills, to win the work, but actually taking half a step back to fulfill those roles sooner, whether it's fractional or otherwise, will absolutely mean you can take 3 steps forward far, far quicker. Again, well, part of my role is doing sort of financial due diligence, reviewing hundreds of businesses, both buy and sell side. And this is often the key risk that comes up time and time again, is it's a fantastic business, commercial story is there, but there isn't a really embedded finance team or HR team, because of the reliance either on outsource or part-time, or it's coming too late. So from an investor standpoint, having that individual that understands the business, whether it's for a longer period of time as a fractional role or a full-time role, just adds a lot of credibility and weight, and will ultimately give you as the business owner a great opportunity to grow. And fractional, I think, is something that we're seeing more and more in the market. It's just because of remote working, it makes it easier. Do businesses need full-time FDs? I don't believe they do necessarily, not in all circumstances. I think fractional is a really good option. As long as, I think we come back to a recurring theme, processes, systems, data is there that they can work with.
Very good. Sam, so just before I move on, I think you mentioned last week you'd worked with a professional services organization recently around MI and connecting systems up. A few words on that?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just for the benefit of those on the webinar as well, I was previously a partner of a national accountancy firm, so I understand some of the dynamics of that. But this was a professional services business that was transitioning from office-based P&Ls. This is all about scalability. So moving from office-based P&Ls to service line P&Ls. Naturally, as a partnership, that creates as a culture. It's a way of growing because it's sort of people relationship driven. They were trying to reduce the reliance on any one individual by saying we operate these services as a brand, as a business, and this is how we need to go to market. In order to do that, there needed to be a sort of restructure of the systems, and as a result, thinking around WIP, recovery of WIP, and therefore how we translate that into revenue and into debtors and cash collection. And so we sort of restructured the whole system so that we gave them instant sort of insight into by service line levels of WIP, which sort of ultimately demystified and made it a lot sort of simpler for them to understand how to go to market because they had their reporting and their sort of back office function working that way. And already, they are seeing material increase because they're working much more collaboratively rather than in silos because they're all driving to generate service line revenue rather than individual sort of partner or office-based revenue.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Are you still engaged with them, or is that assignment finished now?
No, still engaged with them because we work with them on a monthly basis, just giving them support, both access to our system and then ad hoc sort of support as they need it.
Great. Okay.
Marie,
Right.
if I could just one comment on the fractional
Oh,
piece, just very quickly. What you get from fractional is that real targeted expertise and focusing your spend as a business owner. And you find there's a lot of highly qualified individuals who are now operating in fractional roles because actually they prefer to operate in that way. And
yeah.
what they do is they're bringing that wide variety of their own experiences to bear on your business. So, they will see things in other businesses that they're working on that can be brought to bear in your business if you're using them in that way. And I think, we've seen more and more of it. And I think it's really valuable because you get the top level of expertise, but you're only paying for it as you need it, which might be one day a week or a few days a month.
Great point. Great point there. Um, right. Just moving on then in that case. So we are approaching the end of this webinar. So two final areas that I wanted to cover. So I guess this is now a bit of a quick fire round. We're going to look at where areas where businesses might unintentionally leave value on the table. So Daniel, I might just come to you first, but where do you see most commonly, or where do you most commonly see businesses leaving value on the table?
Yeah, okay. So we've talked mostly so far about downside risk because those tend to be the biggest numbers in the end. But obviously, I know there's a lot more interest in a way in short-term immediate cash flows. So I'd say three areas which are tax flavored, which are worth thinking about for any growth business. Probably the one with the biggest value is tax efficient remuneration, generally through long-term or medium-term reward schemes, tax advantage share schemes, and so on, simply because it's cheaper to pay people out of future profits or sale proceeds than it is to pay them cash now and have to deal with the PAYE and NI. So you get a lot more value for your spend at that stage. So always, any fast-growing business with a planned exit should be looking at that seriously. There's then, for many businesses, obviously not all businesses, the R&D incentives remain very valuable, and it's well worth talking to a specialist about any opportunity to make R&D relief claims and generate some immediate cash value through the tax line. And then the third one again, which we have within the group, but genuinely is the third one we would often see as well, is on capital spend, that maximising reliefs through capital allowances. So again, talking to an appropriate expert who can make sure that all of the qualifying spend that creates tax relief is identified is generally money very well spent.
Great, thank you. Ian, how about you?
I think probably 2 points really. Using the right funding in order to allow you to maximize the growth, and that's typically debt. Debt markets have been pretty tough for most people over the last 10 years. Most business owners would probably say, I can't get debt from my current bank because I don't have a supportive bank manager anymore because the way banks operate has completely changed.
Yeah.
But there is a huge proliferation of new funders, new debt funders who are out there. And so I would encourage people who perhaps feel frustrated by not being able to access debt to consider their options. Other advisors are available, but you can come to us and talk to about it, of course. But that's something that I've really noticed over the last 10 years that it's got a lot more complex in the debt markets, and you do have to work your way through with it with an expert alongside you. I think the other point I would make about people leaving value on the table is often going to sale at the wrong time, often because you're compelled rather than you chose to do it. Maybe you've got funding constraints, maybe the market has changed on you unexpectedly, maybe personal issues have arisen, health or those sorts of issues. And these are all tragic and very unfortunate incidents, but people sometimes go to sale have to go to sell at those moments rather than sort of using planned approaches because best value comes when it's planned, when actions are focused, when you can monitor them and you can get the right people doing the right things at the right time. So anticipating and going early. I always talk about, using the first best opportunity to sell. Often people will say, "Oh, I'll leave it a bit longer, a bit longer, a bit longer." And unfortunately, I think as we've seen over the last 10 years, there's always a shock around the corner that nobody can ever anticipate.
Fair enough. So, Rachel, how about you then? Where do you see businesses leaving value on the table?
Yeah, a couple of points to make. First of all, through underutilization of technology and business systems, many companies invest in ERP systems, finance systems, CRM, and they implement it and they finish. They get on with the day job as they say, and they only use a fractional amount of the functionality, so they don't get out of that system what potentially could improve the business. And the second is the major opportunity which lies in the data that they have. I think Sam's already mentioned about looking at the data and getting the data out of the system. So businesses sit there with customer information, invoice margins, profitability, and it's just sat. It's not used. It's not looked at. It's not pulled out of their systems that potentially could give them insight into expansion and more profitability, more value.
Very good. And Sam, how about you then?
I think for me, I'll keep it simple. In the essence of time is speed. And if you can get answers quickly to questions, then you're going to be able to make better decisions. You're going to work out which direction to take if you're going through a transaction. I've seen it time and time again, where you take too long to respond to buyer requests and they've moved on, or they perceive that as something's not right, something's up, and you're immediately leaving value. If you can go back quickly, it breeds confidence and therefore creates more value.
Very good. Right. We are now in the very, very final stretches here. So I guess this is sort of a bit of a wrap up and final pieces of advice here. So turning growth into long-term value. So and this is to all panelists. So if you're advising a founder whose business is growing quickly today, what would you advise them to do now to maximize value over the next 2 to 3 years? I think, Daniel, I'm going to come to you first and then we'll go around the table.
Okay, simple answer. I think ask your tax advisor which things will cost me the most money in 2 or 3 years' time if I don't deal with them now, and then take action based on that advice.
Great stuff. Thank you. Ian?
I think take time to review why you have grown. What of that growth was opportunistic? What did you anticipate? What can you repeat? What could you do that would have made you go faster? So, what can I put in place now that will help me scale? So that because if you can show growth that repeats and is long term, that builds value more than anything, and that only really comes from scalability.
Great. So thank you. Rachel?
Yes, turning growth into long-term value. Disconnect cost, particular people and system costs from revenue wherever you can. Too many businesses scale and they add people and they add systems, and that creates complexity. So disconnect the cost from the revenue. So grow the revenue and keep the cost at a minimum.
Thank you. And then Sam, just to you.
So I think it's my favorite word, which is prepare, naturally. But I think it's don't just grow, just don't try and grow fast. I think really think about building a business that can work without you, but that is, and Ian sort of touched on it, that is built for scale. Don't just grow for growth's sake. Don't just try and grow really fast. Think about it. And if you do that, then it will scale and it will work without you, which as a result creates more value.
Great. Okay. Very final question, which has come in from a member of the audience today. So, again, Sam, I might just put this one to you to begin with. So, the question reads, is selling to private equity a good idea from the perspective of a seller?
So a seller can mean lots of different things, but from my experience working with predominantly with private equity, I've seen it as a force for good and a force to create a lot of value, and value that a lot of business owners don't often see. But it's about getting the structure right and having shareholder alignment. So ensuring that if a seller is looking to totally exit, what is the private equity group planning for the business? Is there a reliance on the seller? If there is a partial reliance and there's an opportunity to release some cash, get some growth capital into the business, and work with the private equity fund to continue growing. There's some fantastic case studies of that. And so it can really be used as a force for good. But again, going into it well advised, because if you go into it without proper advice, then naturally, if there's the cultural alignment isn't there, if the goals are not aligned, if there's not that shareholder alignment that I mentioned, then there's a high risk that it could not go quite in the right way that you would want in the business that you've sort of worked so hard to build up, may not be going in the direction that you expected.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. Thank you. On the screen now, you will see ways in which K3 Advisory Group can work with entrepreneurs, leadership, and their advisors in respect of, the concepts of growth and accelerating it so that we move into sort of scale. Just as I wrap up, then in that case, I think the panelists' contact details will appear on the screen shortly. So I guess what I'm taking away from this and the key themes that have arisen for me today are get the foundations right, repeatability and sustainability, operating leverage and productivity, funding optionality, systems, governance and data, and then avoiding value leakage. I think hopefully that sums up what we talked about today. And I think we are just about finished. I think we are right on 1:30, which we promised to do. That's everything from us today. Thank you very much to you all for joining us. And I hope you have a great week ahead.